So a great example of this, a very simple one, is hugs. So we don't hug each other near enough.
Especially now with COVID.
You're listening to the Nacho Kids Podcast, where we discuss all things step family related. Real stories, real people, real help. Your hosts are the creators of the Nacho Kids Method and the Nacho Kids Academy Step Family Coaching Team, Lori and David Sims.
Welcome to the month of men on the Nacho Kids Podcast. Hello, men.
Oh, men. Man.
Hey, man.
Men.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Yeah, welcome. Sounds kind of creepy every time I say it.
It does. It's better if I say it.
The month of men. I know. Yeah, so we've heard from some very interesting people with some good information and good perspective. I like it.
I do too. I've enjoyed it, and we appreciate everyone that has been a guest on our podcast. And we're going to jump right in. Today, our guest is Matt Larson. He is with the Human Improvement Project, and they are nonprofit, and they have a free parenting app called The Happy Child.
Okay.
So we'll talk more about that. And David, you know I'm a talker.
Mm-hmm.
I could have talked to him for hours and hours and hours, but I didn't.
So you're saying he's more interesting than I am.
He's new.
Yep.
But their parenting app is used in 165 countries.
Okay.
And it's not the parenting app like Family Wizard or whatever the other one is that people use to communicate with the other parent. This is more of an app to help you with building bonds with your kids. And yes, we know that Nacho Kids is about blended families, but that doesn't mean that this information is irrelevant, because most of the times people listening to this also have bio kids.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are nachoing, once you start re-engaging, a lot of these tips are very helpful.
Yep.
We talk about childhood trauma. One of the things that he talks about is even one of his kids said, I feel anxious around you, because apparently Matt likes to pick.
Mm-hmm.
And his son, he doesn't care for it much. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. It's always like, is he going to target me today? Is he going to say something to me when I walk through?
Right. So we talk about what you can do to improve your long-term well-being.
Okay.
We didn't get into everything, of course, but a lot of improving your long-term well-being is stuff that we talk about in the academy. Changing your thinking, being more positive, seeing things from a different perspective. We talk about hugs with Matt.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really proud of myself, because a lot of times when we talk to people, especially like experts like Matt, and what was that lady's name we talked to that one day? I can't remember. We talked to a lady another day, and we got through, and I'm like, I am a horrible parent.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And this one, when he starts talking about hugs, I'm like, I'm doing something right. Because, you know, before Jackson leaves, I'm like, come give me a hug.
Yeah.
And I get my hug.
Yeah.
And I did bring up in this too, David, how your love language is physical touch.
Oh, goodness.
So, no, my question with it was, do the hugs mean more to you?
Of course they do.
I don't think so, because
what do you mean? How do you know?
I know everything.
So now you're answering whether or not something means more to me.
Well, that's like you telling me to try something that you know I'd like it.
Oh.
Like onions.
Again.
You don't know.
But you're saying that you know whether something means more to me.
Okay. I don't know.
That's what I want to hear. Give me a hug.
I'm glad you weren't on this podcast with Matt, because he has a tech background.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, we would have been all nerdy.
Yeah, it would have been a very, very long podcast. But anyway, back to what was I talking about? You would know?
About my love language.
Yes. And I've told you this before, that a lot of times if I am nervous or upset about something, even you just touching my arm almost calms me down.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does have an effect on me, even though that's not my love language. So don't dismiss those hugs, people.
Mm-hmm.
And don't do the one-arm hugs. That drives me insane. If I'm going to hug you, you better hug me back.
Did y'all talk about that?
No, we talked about that today on another podcast I did.
Well, on the same token, though, if I'm meeting somebody of the opposite sex, I'm probably going to do the one arm sideways hug.
Yes.
So just a matter of appropriateness. I don't want necessarily full on body rubbing hugs. That's the only thing I think of. It's funny because, my business partner, which I never talk about on here, but, he's a big fella. And he knows if there's anything he knows how to do to get me to step away from him, he'll say, give me a hug. And I'm like, shut up. Because I'm like, I am not giving your big burly self a hug.
Well, that's funny. It isn't this podcast, but it's the one I recorded today where the person I was interviewing was talking about how, men aren't as cool about stuff like that.
No, we'll slap each other on the butt on the football field, but we won't give no hugs.
And he made a comment that he's got a friend that, he just adores him and he loves him and they've been through a lot together and he appreciates him. And he's like, anytime I hug him, he goes stiff. And he said that sometimes he'll be like, I've got to hug you, right? And the guy's like,
It just depends on how you do it. Because my friend Johnny, he's another big guy. Me and him give each other bro hugs. So when you do like that bro hug, like that one arm where you'd like kind of give each other that, high five kind of deal. And then you pull each other in and you like, hit them on the back a couple times. It's almost like the Heimlich maneuver type thing where, you walk away. It's like, I don't know if that was a hug or if he's trying to knock me out.
Yeah. So, David, you do have a point about the whole, hug thing. I don't want you fully embracing some stranger lady that
let's have a month of women.
We've had several months of women, Goofy. One other thing, I was really impressed with Matt. I really was. And I think I told him a million times, but he was involved in getting the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act passed.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. I remember when that happened.
Yeah.
I was a kid. I don't remember how old I was. I think I might have been a teenager, but I just remember my parents like, you can't go anywhere without me knowing where you're at. And I'm like, what in the world is happening? Because, back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was growing up, you do what you want, where you want, when you want. And then all of a sudden it just felt like everything changed. And then, when I found out about the story, I was like, oh my gosh, how horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting though, because that Adam Walsh was not the first child that was abducted, but it received a lot of publicity.
Yeah.
And they even have Code Adams because of that. And I think it's great. So, of course, probably without me even telling you, that I told Matt, I'm like, oh, great, you can help me change the family court system.
Yeah.
Y'all, I'm not giving up on that. I might be 90. So Matt talks about cortisol and oxytocin and all this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be overwhelmed by him talking about those things. Basically, they're just things in our body that make us happy or make us sad.
Mm-hmm.
So don't feel overwhelmed when he's talking about it and go, I don't even know what this man's talking about.
Should have paid attention in science class.
So, David, since you paid so much attention in school, what's oxytocin?
Oxytocin is that thing that your pituitary gland releases to make you feel good.
Okay, we'll go with that.
And then cortisol is that nasty stuff that your pituitary gland releases.
Your pituitary gland?
Yeah, pituitary gland. That's hard to say quickly. Anyway, that's your stressor hormone. It eats away at you.
Your hormone?
Hormone. I just can't say anything right. Anyway, the cortisol stuff is nasty. That's, that's the thing that gets released when you have all this stress and it causes all these health issues.
Well, David, I realized talking to Matt that you cause my cortisol levels to rise because I'm always afraid of what you're going to say.
There's a difference between stress and uncertainty.
Okay, but they both cause cortisol to rise.
Okay. At the same time, I am also...
When we're at the church event and you open your mouth, my cortisol levels shoot to the roof. The Stepmoms Alive conference.
Oh, really?
Dude.
You were nervous every time I said something?
I'm nervous when you say something here.
Yeah, but you can edit here.
Yes. Thank you, Jesus.
I do take full advantage of the times when we're live.
I know you do. And most of that's to get a reaction. I mean, because you're a button pusher. Right?
No.
Really?
Yes, I am the founder of the Button Pushers of the World Foundation International.
You made fun of me the other day for saying button pushers.
I know.
And I think I edited it out. Okay, anyway. Yeah, we're off the chain today. So get to listening to Matt Larson and download the Happy Child app. I downloaded it and I'm going through it. It's very interesting. It really is.
That's right.
And it's easy to use, like easy.
Yep. And if you listen to it, you'll have all the oxytocin you need.
And if you would like to leave feedback regarding this, you can always email us and I'll send it to Matt.
Yeah, but please don't send any email that will create cortisol.
Cortisol, hang on. That was the bad feeling.
See? Should have paid attention in science class.
I don't remember that from science class.
Or I guess maybe it's chemistry. I don't know. It was one of them classes I was in.
I don't even know. In chemistry, you wouldn't talk about this.
I don't know. Maybe it was the Trivial Pursuit game I played and I learned it.
That's what it was. All right. Now we figured it all out. David's knowledge comes from Trivial Pursuit.
All right, folks, let's get to listening before she goes run off somewhere else. But first, here's a word about the Academy.
There is a way to save your sanity and your relationship, and it's called the Nacho Kids Academy. In the Nacho Kids Academy, you will learn the skills and knowledge to properly nacho, techniques to handle step-family challenges, ways to improve your communication, and much, much more. Visit NachoKidsAcademy.com and sign up today to join other step-parents who are seeing the life-changing benefits of nachoing. Again, that's NachoKidsAcademy.com.
Today, we have Matt Larson with the Human Improvement Project. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. So the Human Improvement Project is a nonprofit.
That's right. It is. It's a nonprofit research institution that studies the question, what makes the biggest difference to long-term well-being? And we particularly focus on kids. So we'll study experiences that kids have and then sort of how that affected them later in life if they ended up having mental health issues like anxiety or depression, criminal behavior, homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction, and just sort of, general long-term well-being. So that's essentially what we do. So we do research on our own. We fund research in universities, and then we come out with content that basically shares that with the world, completely free. We're a nonprofit, so everything that we do is completely free. And we have the top parenting apps in the world. So we are used in 165 countries, 15 different languages, and we have millions and millions of parents all over the world sort of learning what these fundamental issues are that impact long-term well-being in children.
Great. I know a tad about the parenting apps, not yours, but just in general. I know some of them say I'm messaging my son's father and I kind of have a hateful tone. It's like it will tell you, hey, this is kind of hateful, or you need to change this word, but won't let you type certain words to where you can't bash the person. Does your apps offer that?
No, what we really do. So it might be helpful to sort of talk about how we ended up doing this, right? Why somebody with my background ever ended up in this space where suddenly, we're doing this, because it really, I never would have guessed it. And I don't think most people who knew me would have ever thought this is where I would have ended up. So I think maybe kind of explaining how this came about might kind of help explain, what the app really does and why it does what it does. Would that be helpful to talk about?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. So I come from a tech software background. So I've been the CEO of a number of tech companies, on the boards of a number of tech companies. I'm the chairman of 2 software companies right now, although I spend very little time on that. I spend almost all my time on this nonprofit research institution. But what happened with me is I started my nonprofit journey about 15 years ago, and my wife and I I had sold part of a software company. And so we started a family foundation, and we said, our goal is to do whatever most is going to help children in the United States. That was our target market. And we said, we're going to use a formula to figure out how to best do that. And so our formula was, 1, how many kids does this issue affect? 2, how much pain does it cause them? And 3, what's the duration of that pain? How long does that pain last? Like a broken arm is a lot of pain, but just for a short amount of time. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up putting every childhood issue that we could find into that formula, from childhood diseases to drownings to car accidents to everything you can think of. And what ended up coming out at the top of that formula was child sexual abuse. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself. But we basically found out that the biggest way to solve that was some things in the federal government. So we worked with the federal government, and it was a very bizarre situation. From when we started to maybe 6 to 9 months later, we're standing in the Rose Garden of the White House. Our bill had been passed. We're shaking hands with the Senate Majority Leader who helped us pass it. And it ended up being one of the most significant bills that has affected that issue in the United States. So every year, about 12,000 suspected pedophiles get arrested under that bill. So, for example, in the next hour, statistically, 3 will get arrested. So we had sort of worked on that issue for some time. But a few years ago, me and another tech CEO were on a walk, and the question came up: what's the thing that I could do that would make the biggest difference to my long-term well-being? And I didn't know the answer to that. I didn't know, was I supposed to eat more vegetables? Was I supposed to exercise more? Was I supposed to get more education in some area? I had no idea, and neither did he. He didn't know what would be best for his family. So we thought, that's kind of strange that we don't know what the most important thing is that we should work on. And so what we decided to do was to fund a clinical trial. So we hired some participants, and then we had a bunch of experts. We had psychologists and doctors and nutritionists and fitness people and just anybody we could think of. And the experts would say, go ask this participant, maybe if you were one, go ask Lori all these questions. And then Lori would answer, and we would go back to them and say, okay, here's how she answered. And they would say, go ask these follow-up questions. So we go back and forth until eventually they said, yes, we think this is Lori's number one issue, and this is Bob's number one issue, and so on. Well, what shocked us was that all of those participants only had one of 2 issues at the top. They were always at the top of the list, and we were not aware of either one of these issues. So we're like, wow, that's crazy. So we then started talking to more experts, and pretty quickly somebody said, oh, you guys rediscovered what Harvard and the CDC discovered. And by the way, these 2 issues essentially are the biggest factors for these big issues in society. So they're the biggest factors, besides some genetic issues, are the biggest factors in criminal behavior, anxiety, depression, anger issues, bullying, homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction, just general poor life satisfaction scores, poverty rates. I mean, and it was too hard to believe. It's like, wait a minute, you're telling me these 2 issues are the prime predictors, along with genetics, of all of these societal problems? And they said, yes. And we said, well, why do you guys know this? And the public obviously doesn't. We had no idea. And I remember one professor said, Matt, I've been giving talks on this stuff for 20 years, and the public just doesn't resonate with them. Somehow it's not working. And so we said, well, as tech people, to be successful in the tech world, you really have to be very good at the science of messaging. You can have lots of software companies have great software, but you have to be really good at that science of messaging to get people to want to try yours, of all the good ones out there, to try yours. So we said, this could be a messaging issue. We're going to, even though this is not something we're experts in, we're going to really dive into this thing and figure out if we can figure out how to message it. And so what we ended up finding is the current messaging that they were using was not only not good, it was basically a complete disaster. It would completely, make everybody try to avoid the topics as much as possible. But what we ended up saying is, okay, we ended up doing enormous amounts of research, having lots and lots of studies with parents. I mean, thousands of parents have reviewed personally our lessons with us and talked about, what scared them in the lessons and what they liked about it and all that. And so we really polished that so that we could get this core information to families to really transform what they're doing, but yet, just do it in a way that they liked, that they enjoyed, that made them excited to go try in their own family. So we are really focused on these two issues, the two issues that we can measure in children and then predict what, their long-term well-being as adults. And so we really teach the skills for those two underlying issues. So rather than dealing with surface, level issues, we really get down to this fundamental core. We start with these two core issues, and then we build the skill sets around those. And then we have these really high, what we call behavioral change scores, where we measure parents 6 months later, for example, and ask them, in the last month, has your behavior changed in these various areas? And we get tremendous behavioral change, because once you learn this stuff, it's hard to unlearn it. It's sort of, people kind of describe it as, oh, the lights got turned on in our family, and now we really know what's happening. So that's a very long answer, but that's essentially how we got here and why we really focus on just the most important things and how to influence those.
Okay, I have a question. What is the bill that you mentioned being passed?
So the bill is called the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. It's named after Adam Walsh, who was abducted. His father, now I'm going to, of course, forget his first name, but he's had a lot of shows on TV and sort of become very much sort of an advocate for this stuff, since then. So you would recognize, if I said his name, which I can't believe I'm forgetting it right now, you would, John Walsh is his name.
Okay.
So John Walsh has had a lot of crime-related shows, or at least you'd recognize him if you saw what he looked like. But that all kind of happened because his son was abducted. And so that's the name of the bill.
From a mall, right?
I think that's right. I mean, the story, this all happened, we did all that maybe 15 years ago. And since we've sort of switched focus now to this other issue, I forget all the details of that. But I think it was maybe a mall or a sort of a store, like a department store, but I forget the details.
Sears.
That might be right. Yeah.
In 1981, his son was abducted from a Sears department store. Yeah, because I've watched those shows. So I knew who you were talking about, but I couldn't remember his name either. That is great. I am really impressed with how far you've come in such a short time. I mean, that's awesome. When you said you were on at the White House, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. And then I'm thinking, you can help me change the family court system.
Maybe. I mean, I think we're growing really rapidly, as you can imagine. So we essentially only have time to respond to people who approach us. And that's usually what happens is somebody will approach us about, hey, how do we get this into the school systems? And we're, working with people on that, or universities will approach us. How can we work on that? But the court systems is absolutely on our plan of, we really need to, we need to be able to get into that, because those kids, often are some of them that need it most.
Right. So what are the two issues that you discovered?
So before I get into them, let me kind of explain sort of the analogy of what I think is happening here. And then I'll talk about the two issues. So Both of them are these chemicals, these hormones in your body in very specific situation. But I liken it to, a lot of people are familiar with vitamin C and scurvy. So back in the days of Magellan and Vasco da Gama, they would lose 70 to 90% of their crew would die of scurvy. And that was basically what we now know as a lack of vitamin C. But for hundreds of years, they could not tell what was going on. Some thought they were eating too much meat, and others thought they were just out at, there was some disease at sea and so on. And so it caused all sorts of chaos, but it did vary, right? Some captains had lower, and they didn't realize that they were maybe, having a type of vegetable that had more vitamin C in it. It was, sunshine can destroy vitamin C. Heating it, like if you cook certain foods, you'll kill the vitamin C in it. So it was really confusing. And that's essentially what's happened now with these two issues. So these two hormones that I'm going to talk about are affected by just about everything that we do. And that's why it's been so confusing. That's why we haven't really been able to isolate them until relatively recently, in the last really decade. Now, there's been tens of thousands of studies on each of these since then, but so we'll kind of think about it like that first. But let me talk about the first issue. So the first issue, the first of the two biggest predictors that we know of is a hormone called cortisol, but it's not in every case. So cortisol is used for 15 to 20 things in our body, most of which is really important, but we have no control of, and it's fine the way that it is. But it's only cortisol in one very specific situation, and that is when we are basically nervous that something's going to happen that will cause our emotions to suddenly plummet. An example of this, so this happens in every family in America. So in my family, for example, this was happening. I didn't know this. So a common situation is being critical or sarcastic. So when I asked my kids about this, one of my 3 kids, when I said, hey, is there ever a time when, are you nervous around me that I might say something, a joke, or say something critical of you? And are you just nervous when you're around me? And 2 of my kids said no, but one of them said, yes, Dad, I'm always nervous around you. I'm like, what? And it turned out it was because I would make a sarcastic joke about once a month. Let's say that's my guess. Mm-hmm. So for, that 10 seconds, I'm making a joke, but he was nervous. He had that high elevated cortisol level the entire month when he was around me. And that's one of these big predictors. That's the first one. Now, in our completely free apps, put out by our nonprofit, we cover that in a lot more detail. But that is the first one, is we basically ask questions about things that would make them, nervous that something's going to happen again. Now, as adults, we experience this too, right? There's certain people that we get around that we're just kind of nervous around them, right? We're nervous that they're going to say something hurtful, or that they're going to, say something that makes us uncomfortable. Maybe it's somebody at work, maybe it's a family member. That's the number one predictor, or that's one of the top 2 predictors. So that is what we call the long-term unhappiness chemical. The more cortisol you have raised because of that particular issue, you're nervous something is about to make your emotions plummet. That's that first predictor. Any questions on that before I go to the second one?
Yeah. An example could be, say that you've got a spouse that cuts up a lot, and they say things sometimes that you think are borderline inappropriate. So when you go out to dinner, say with your work people, and your husband's going with you, you could be nervous or anxious, and your cortisol levels rise because you're afraid of something he's going to say.
That is a perfect example. That's right.
And another example I'm thinking of as far as blended families was if a child goes, just say they do every other week at the parent's home. When they go back on Monday and the bio parent says, so what did you do at your other parent's house? That can cause that cortisol to rise because they're afraid of what answer to give. They don't want to say they had a good time because it might hurt their dad. They don't want to say they had a crappy time because then the dad will contact the mom, and it just causes a lot of stress.
That is right on the money, Lori. And I think, so one of the things that we talk about is, and that we teach inside the app, is that it's really important to sort of become very, let's say, skilled at naming underlying emotions. And so that's maybe too big of a topic for right here, but we teach those skills in that, because the more you can understand the emotions your child is going to have, you'll actually increase your long-term well-being and their long-term well-being. So that's one thing that's really important with all of this, is like when you're doing something that might be raising the cortisol level in the other person, it will lower their long-term well-being. It will also lower yours. So it's either a win-win or it's a lose-lose. And those are, I think, really good, example situations. And maybe, we don't have enough time on this one, but sort of the more of those that you can name those situations for your listeners, and can kind of say, hey, this is another situation where that might help. And just, help us as parents feel the emotions that the child is feeling, then we can start, reducing that significantly. And that's what we find, is that both of these issues are very solvable. Like this is not rocket science. You don't have to have major surgery. You don't have to have, go out and spend a huge amount of money. This is very solvable, completely for free. It does take some practice, but I think, yes, those examples, and I think we all have lots of those, but the more you can sort of think of like that, I think the more it will help your listeners really get that sense of, oh, that's a situation where I'm making them nervous. Or maybe if I'm asking them about, my ex-spouse, and I'm kind of digging for dirt a little bit, right? And they're nervous about that. That would, any situation like that we can kind of bring out in the open and make people think about and feel the child's feeling, reduces that and helps both the parent and the child.
Right. Okay.
So that's the first one. And, there's a lot more that I think, we can talk about there. So that's the long-term unhappiness chemical. Now let's get to the long-term happiness chemical.
Okay.
And that is oxytocin. So again, oxytocin is used for, 15, 20 things in the body, most of which we don't need to, worry too much about. But what we're talking about is oxytocin released in safe relationships. Okay. So the most common is, if I have a safe relationship with my child, which means, we don't have time to get into all these, but it means things like I don't emotionally ambush them, right? One of the things that causes that first chemical is cortisol, is when they're just sitting in the kitchen and I come in, that again says something that makes their emotions plummet. So I come in and say, why'd you pick that shirt to wear? Or, why are you eating that? Or, something critical. They're just sitting there and bam, their emotions suddenly go down. So if I emotionally ambush people a lot, I might not be a safe person. Or if on the other side, if I emotionally surprise them a lot. So an emotional surprise is where they're just sitting there, let's say eating their breakfast, and I come in and I say, I like you, or you're a great kid, or something like that. Now I surprise them with a flood of good emotion. So there's this whole concept of how do we become a safe person. But oxytocin, if it's released inside of safe relationships, is the long-term happiness predictor. So a great example of this, a very simple one, is hugs. So we don't hug each other near enough.
Especially now with COVID.
We actually we do it right at the beginning of relationships. So when we have a new baby or a young child, we'll hug them and kiss them all the time. And they get tons of oxytocin from that. And that's really good for them, right? That's a really healthy situation. As they get older and older, we stop giving them those hugs. Essentially, we stop giving them oxytocin and we start starving them of this long-term happiness chemical. So, for example, in my family, we're constantly giving each other hugs, right? If somebody's eating their breakfast, I'm coming up and like I did this morning with one of my kids who I saw, around breakfast time, I came up and, gave him a hug, kissed him on the top of his head. So all of that releases oxytocin. And right now we essentially start starving our kids of it as they get older. When my wife and I learned this, we started doing things like, for example, when we have our coffee in the morning, if we, are doing that at the same time, we'll sit on the couch up against each other. And that was something that worked for us. Well, we also tried to sort of and for a while there we did. So in the, as we would sleep, maybe our feet would touch or something like that. And that just ended up being that was just too distracting. And so we ended up kind of settling in on whenever we watch TV, we'll usually watch TV for half hour before, as we're going to bed, and we'll hold hands while we're doing that. And that sounds sweet. And but it's really, we have a close relationship because we do these oxytocin things rather than it just being a sign of it. Right. And so in romantic relationships, early on, we do huge amounts of non-sexual touching, right? We're always holding hands and giving hugs and all of that kind of stuff. But the same thing happens. As the relationship ages, we kind of think, oh, that's a young relationship thing. And so we start starving our romantic partner of oxytocin. And we get really agitated with them. And we don't understand why, right? When we think it's about the dishes and, all of these different issues. But what it appears to be is about oxytocin, we're starving each other of oxytocin and probably cortisol issues as well, right? These two issues are the main issues. Either, hey, I'm nervous that you're going to be critical of me. You're going to be critical of the route I drove, to wherever we're going or whatever, or I'm not getting enough oxytocin, from you and that type of thing. So that's the long-term happiness chemical. You definitely want to make sure, you're getting enough. There's, been some recent research on the 20-second hug. So purposefully saying, okay, if I can have, if I can give each family member one 20-second hug, a week, that we know that there's a huge amount of oxytocin in that 20-second hug. I try to do it every day. I don't quite get there. With my youngest son, I still put him to bed, so I give him one every day. But I have two teens. I've got a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, so I don't see them quite as much. But those are the two factors. So we can largely just look at those two issues and then say, okay, this child, we don't know, if this child grows up, what issue they'll have. We don't know if they'll have what they call internalizing issues, like mental health issues like anxiety or depression, or if that will express itself as, addiction issues or homelessness or so on. But what we know is that it will almost always express itself in one of these ways that is not good for them, that they won't enjoy. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, I have a question. Have you done any research with this in relation to the love languages? So, for instance, my husband's love language is physical touch.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is acts of service. So I almost have to remind myself I need to give him a hug today. Now, like you said in the beginning when we were dating, that wasn't the case. But as we've been married 11 years, it's like, oh yeah, I need to go give him a hug because he needs that. And not that I don't need that, because I know there is a calmness that comes across me when we do hold hands or just hug for 5 seconds. You can almost like feel each other's energy, for lack of a better word. And it's a calming presence for me. So I was just curious if you have done any research related to the love languages with this.
So love languages, from a research perspective, I haven't run into scientists that seem to think that holds up a lot from a research perspective. When they've done a lot of research on it, my understanding is the vast majority of people in this space, and it's not one I've ever done research on, don't think that has held up a lot in terms of making a significant difference when they sort of take one group of subjects and test them and against a placebo group and all that stuff. They can't see that model tends to work. There are some other models. There's one called emotionally focused therapy, which is that one has quite a bit of evidence to it. But I haven't, and I might be wrong on that. There may be. That isn't, my area, but that's my general sense. But getting to this issue of some people don't like getting hugs, for example,
right?
And what really is what we think is happening there. When I talked about how oxytocin is the long-term happiness chemical, if it's released in safe relationships, what we often find is that people do need it. But the problem is they had oxytocin released in unsafe relationships. And so their brain sort of associates oxytocin with subconsciously with some sort of past pain, a past romantic partner that, in a romantic relationship, we have all sorts of oxytocin release. Well, if you've experienced some bad breakups, you can actually be conditioned to avoid it. And it sort of would be like if somebody gave you, fruits and vegetables and shocked you every time you ate fruits and vegetables, right? They caused you pain every time you did. You would shy away from fruits and vegetables. Now, it still would be, that wouldn't be good for you. That would, actually be very bad for you because, fruits and vegetables are good for us. But that's what can happen. And so if we feel like, hey, this is a safe relationship, then we almost have to push ourselves a little bit more to say, I need sort of my fruits and vegetables for lack of a better example. I know that I need this for my long-term well-being. It's not comfortable for me right now, but I need to sort of push through that because it's the long-term happiness chemical.
Right. And I've always thought about this. I did a lot of research on the mind when I did the Change Your Stinking Thinking Challenge in the Nacho Kids Academy. And the mind amazes me. And see, your mind is what tells your body to release these chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
So our mind is not always our friend because it tries to protect us based off past experience. Like you said, with, the example of the vegetables and stuff. When I see someone tell their little kid to go hug somebody, well, go give so-and-so a hug, go give so-and-so a hug, it makes me uncomfortable.
Right.
Because what if they're making them give this person a hug, but that child doesn't feel safe doing it, but they're doing it because their parent told them to? I mean, that could cause long-term issues.
I agree. And I want to be clear. I'm in no way saying that. Again, I there's all sorts of reasons not to, do that. That sort of, gets into some topics of why you can kind of put your child more in danger of future child sexual abuse and issues like that. Not, that could be sort of the most extreme situation. But if you kind of say you need to express physical, affection with people that you don't want to, it can really send the wrong signal. So I'm in no way saying that. I don't mean go out and have your kid, start hugging everybody.
Oh, no, I know that's not what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I think about that when I do see that happen, because I'm like, you can tell sometimes little Johnny's not comfortable hugging Aunt Lucy.
Right.
And it's like, well, don't make him do it. It's okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
We want to train our kids that they're the boss of, they're the boss of their own body. They don't get to be the boss of much, but they do get to be the boss of, of their own body. That's kind of an important, lesson that kids need to learn that can help them when they get into, more serious situations later in life.
Exactly.
So we have these two core issues, right? So that's, and people can kind of sometimes get lost when we talk about the chemical stuff. So let's bring it up a level. Let's talk about the things that most impact those issues that are a little more concrete. And so one of them is this concept of deep bonds. So part of how we discovered the importance of deep bonds, and other scientists had discovered it long before in their own ways. But part of how we did in our research is we were doing some research on couples, and we were studying couples who had been married. These were heterosexual couples who had been married 15 to 20 years. And as part of our questions, we would ask them, we would kind of start the question out by saying, how with your in this case, their spouse or your romantic partner, how you get, sometimes you get in sort of an argument and you kind of avoid each other for a couple of days. One of you's ticked off at the other one and you don't kind of talk for a couple of days. And then we were asking some follow-up question, but some of these couples who were, again, married 15 to 20 years looked really confused. They both look confused. They're looking at each other. They're asking me questions like, do you think we do that? No, I don't think we do. Do you think we do that? And me and my co-founder were really confused because we both think that we're in, good relationships and so on. But we're like, how is it possible that you don't have those? And so we thought maybe we were asking the question wrong. Well, it happened. It was rare, of course, but it would happen periodically in these relationships. And so what we eventually found out was that when you looked at, we'll start with the wife, she had a deep bond with both her mom and with both her father. And if you looked at the husband in that relationship, so did he. Now, maybe they weren't biological, maybe it was a stepfather or, it was something like that, but they would both have sort of these two parental figures that they had a deep bond with. And then, you looked at their relationship and it was this unbelievably calm, mature, loving relationship. And so then that led us to sort of learning all about attachment and all of that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that we figured out was that we as a society don't know how to build deep bonds. They're basically random. That's why you kind of go, I'm really close friends with some people and other people we just didn't hit it off and we're not close friends with them. So you have this sort of randomness. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, that also happens with our children. So if you don't learn how to specifically build a deep bond with your child, it's unfortunate, but you are statistically unlikely to have a deep bond with that child when they are an adult. Now, so in other words, it's less than 50% chance that you will if you haven't learned these particular skills. Now, thankfully, they're pretty easy skills to learn and that type of thing. So one of the things is that it's important to have this concept that I want to have a deep bond with this child, that is a goal. And again, it's pretty easy to learn how to do that. It turns out that when we study parents and we determine what their primary goal is, the vast majority of parents, their primary goal is not to have a deep bond with their child. Their primary goal is to influence their child. So they basically want their child to make the same decisions that they would make if they were in the child's shoes. And the child picks up on that, of course, right? They know that they're trying to be influenced, that that's their parents' primary motivation. And so they do the opposite. They do the opposite. They go, I don't want you influencing me all the time. I'm going to try to do the opposite. And they specifically don't want a deep bond with that parent, right? Like if you think about your own adult relationships, if you have somebody who's constantly trying to change you, you don't want to have a close relationship with them, right? You want somebody who just wants to be close with you and isn't trying to, constantly change you. Mm-hmm. So that's what happens. So when a parent's primary goal is to influence, they don't get the influence and they don't get the deep bond. That's essentially what happens with that path. However, if a parent's primary goal is to have a deep relationship with that child, a lifelong deep bond with that child, what we find is that the child picks up on that. They know, hey, my parents' goal is to be close with me, and that's what we need as humans. And so ironically, they also ask them for advice, which really shocked me when I went through this change with my kids. I was a typical parent like everybody else, giving all sorts of advice, trying to get them to make all the same decisions I would make. And of course, they would never ask me for advice. And then once, we shifted to my goal should be to have a deep bond with them, it's really shocking when they would start coming to me for advice. But, that's how this works. That's why when we get into a bad situation or a situation where we need advice, we're most likely to go get advice from our close friends. Even though they may not be the best to give advice, we'll go ask them anyways because we have that deep bond with them. And the people we will avoid are the people who are always trying to influence us. The last thing that we're going to do is go give them the satisfaction of asking for their advice again. And now, man, if I ask them for advice, they're going to flood me with advice for the next 6 months. So we avoid them. So does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Makes perfect sense.
So we need that goal to have a deep bond, and we need to learn how to do that. It's really important to learn how to have a deep. Another important thing is this messaging inside of your family that for every member in this household, we might have, a stepfather and a stepmother and, let's say 2 kids from 2 different biological families. Let's say that was 6 people, all those 6 people. If each person has a deep bond with each other person in there, or even just with one other person in there, both of their long-term well-being goes up. Mm-hmm. If you decide, okay, with this other family member, I'm not going to have a good relationship with them, I'm not going to have a deep bond with them, both of their long-term well-being goes down. So it's either, each one of those pairs of people in that family, if they have a close relationship, they both go up. If they don't, they both go down. So what ends up happening is you have this thing where everyone realizes, if I don't have a close relationship with the others, my long-term well-being goes down. And everybody's got that mindset. And so what ends up happening is everyone's trying to work on those relationships. And they do that because we're selfish human beings, right? We want to improve our own lives. So if we believe that that's true, which it is, then we all want to do that. So you end up creating this home where some may make mistakes sometimes, right? They'll still annoy their sibling from time to time, but in general, they know that the goal here is to build bonds because it will help me later on, right? I mean, mm-hmm. And it'll help them, but mostly I just care about me, right? Because humans are selfish. So having this environment of talking about deep bonds, asking people, about their deep bonds with other members of the family. If I see, one of my kids teasing another, I might say something like, is that building your bond or is that tearing it down? And, they understand that. Then they value that. They see how, that we sort of made this transition as a family and we're closer now. And nobody kind of wants to go back to before then because it's just a, much calmer, more enjoyable situation. Mm-hmm. So this concept of deep bonds is really critical. Any questions on that before I go to the next one?
No, I'm thinking with our whole Nacho Kids method and how it was created, when you create these bonds, it took me a while to create the bonds that I have with my stepkids because I haven't known them since the beginning of time. And they had to learn to trust me, and I didn't push my influence on them, like you said.
Yeah.
Whereas parents do tend to do that. So when the kids ask me something instead of their dad, I'm like, look at there. They asked me and not you. But it's also because they know that I won't judge them for it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And so when we look at, so if we know deep bonds are the biggest issue, how do we build them, right? What's the number one way to build a deep bond? And it turns out that it's kind of unexpected, but it's essentially helping them process their hurtful experiences. I'll kind of explain more about that. So that's the number one way to build a deep bond with somebody. Put it another way, how you act when they're having a tough time. So one of the key factors that we look at is when somebody is upset about something, it could be pretty minor, right? They got a bad grade at school, or somebody didn't sit with them at lunch or something, or maybe it's even, less than that. They just, I don't know, they were just kind of grumpy today or something. But for some reason, they're in this emotional state where they had a slightly bad day, not a horrible day, just a, kind of a bad day. Well, it turns out that the first predictor that we can kind of look at is, do people in the family notice and care? And actually, this might help to sort of understand that sort of throughout, virtually all of human history, we lived in tribes. We lived in tribes that were pretty, dangerous in the sense that, we didn't have houses and neighborhoods and all that stuff that can kind of protect us now. We could get attacked pretty quickly from a neighboring tribe, or a wild animal could attack us when we were 100 yards away from the village, or that type of thing. So when we're in danger, when our brains think we're in danger, one of the things that we most care about is somebody else noticing and caring that I'm in danger. Because back then, if you didn't notice that this wild animal was about to attack and kill me, then I would die, right? This was a life or death situation. And our brains are still largely organized that way, right? I mean, just because society rapidly changed, it doesn't mean our brains did. Our brains are really more designed for that. I mean, pretty much in psychology, you can look at issue after issue, and it makes perfect sense when you're talking about, tribal situations, and it doesn't make any sense in modern society. Well, this is one of those. So even though your child comes home from school and they're not in any real danger, their brain says, I'm in danger. And they are watching you to see if you're going to notice and care. And when you don't notice and care, this fight or flight portion of their brain, the amygdala, basically you can think of it as starting to light up, right? The primitive portions of their brain start to light up. And again, it doesn't seem to make much sense. Who cares if, they don't just had a bad day? Why should you care about that? But it turns out that alarms the same thing with our romantic partner. So if we're having a bad day and they blow it off, they don't notice, they don't care, our primitive portions of our brain start lighting up. So the first one is to notice and care. And we think that we do that. We think, and of course we do if they had a death in the family or something horrible happened. If we're pretty good at that.
Something big.
Yeah, at extreme situations. But we're terrible at the day-to-day experiences of something's, some mild thing is gone wrong and we just don't care. And so that alone of doing that makes a huge difference. So like in my family, I'm really proud of, this sort of habit that my kids have is my wife might, have a bad day for whatever reason. And they will sense that. You can almost see their heads snap towards her, almost like a lion looking at its prey kind of thing. Now, that's the wrong analogy, but they notice right away and they will converge on her, right? Oh, Mom, do you need a hug? And, they'll come over and give her a hug and, oh, you want me to make you some tea, that type of thing. Well, that in her brain, right, in the human brain, that really calms that person down. It makes them feel safe, and that increases long-term well-being. That will increase her long-term happiness. Now, it also is actually good for them in that situation because it gives them this sense of purpose, right? And so that's something we should all have, is that's part of our purpose. Our purpose is to help our other people who live in our home when they're upset, right? If we do that, their long-term well-being goes up, our long-term well-being goes up. So that's the first thing, is just that, notice and care. And it doesn't take very long, right? To, hey, what's going on? Sorry that, you had a bad day. Sorry your friend, said something on Facebook that, was against what you said, or something like that. It doesn't take much, but strangely, that makes a big difference. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, it does. Because you're noticing that they exist, number one, and you're noticing something's kind of off with them, and you're offering to be there for them so they know they're not alone.
That's right. And before I get to sort of the second step of that process, the noticing that you exist is another interesting one, which was surprising to us when we kind of came across this research. But there's a certain percentage of people that feel invisible. And it tends to be more female than male, but there certainly are lots of boys and men who feel invisible also. One thing you can do is, if you have a close enough relationship, is you can ask somebody, hey, do you ever just kind of feel invisible? And some people will look at you like you're crazy and say no. And other people, they'll sort of stop short and, they'll say, yeah, I do. Sometimes I feel like nobody sees me, kind of thing. Well, first of all, that's kind of important to know, because some kids will and some kids won't, and your partner may or may not. It's good to know that. If they do, it's particularly important that you do this other thing, which is, when you haven't seen them in a while, you see them in the morning, you see them when they come home from school or work, that type of thing, you smile and you greet them and you say, hey, so-and-so. And just that makes them feel seen, and will start, addressing that invisibility issue. It's shocking that little thing that you can do is just, you see them, you look at them, you smile them, you're, happy to see them. That alone will make a big, difference to invisibility. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's actually a more widespread issue than people realize.
Especially with stepmoms. And when you said more women than men, I'm like, yeah, because I'm thinking about the stepmom groups. And a lot of times when the stepkids come for visitation, the stepmom's like, it's like I don't even exist. The bio parent spends all their time with their kid. If I say something, it's ignored. So they really do feel invisible.
Yeah.
And that does not make anybody feel good. Feeling invisible or feeling alone are two of the saddest things.
It is. I agree. And it creates this cycle. There's probably more cycles than this, but one cycle is the sort of anxiety, depression cycle, right? You kind of go into this, sort of internalizing negative process. The other one is attacking. So what people who feel invisible can do to get attention is attack. And in the short term, it does, right? Attacking means, verbally attacking, saying something critical, yelling, that kind of thing. And it does get some attention in the short term, but in the long term, people will try to ignore them even more, right? Everybody leaves the room, right? And it makes them feel even more invisible. So it's a sort of vicious cycle. And I think, if you can work to make the home an emotional safe haven, which again, there's lots of things in our completely free app with no advertisements that sort of teach all that. You can get to a place of trust where you can say that. You can say, I feel invisible in these situations, and people can help. Kids will understand that, and they can start responding to that. It really is this very sweet situation once you end up building this level of trust and you start addressing, these core issues, in the family.
Right. And I know that we're mainly talking about kids here, but I see so many similarities with what the step parents feel in the blend. And it probably relates to their own childhood trauma.
Yeah, so childhood trauma essentially raises that long-term unhappiness chemical. That raises our sense of being on edge, of nervous that, hey, somebody treated me poorly in the past. So now I'm kind of nervous around anybody like that. So if it was a man who treated me, badly when I was a child, I might be a little nervous around all men, or I might be a little nervous around men that have a certain hair color or whatever. But my cortisol levels get raised, and in all of these situations. So yeah, those really relate to that. And yes, even though we focus on kids, exactly the same principles apply to adults. I haven't seen any scientific data that shows that it's any different. We just happen to have more of a focus on kids, because if we can address it in our kids, it's easier to sort of address the issue sort of early on than later. But it absolutely can, be addressed later. But that's basically what's going on. Is we have these issues that raise our cortisol. We probably may not have gotten enough oxytocin in safe relationships. We may have actually gotten oxytocin in unsafe relationships, which hurts long-term well-being. So yeah, that can have a lot of those issues.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The other thing, about deep bonds. So we talked about, this thing of, I sort of think of it as, think about how often do you notice and care when somebody's upset? And how quickly do you? So does it take you 10 minutes, or, if you notice and care within a minute of somebody coming into the room, like, to me, that's like Olympic level stuff. Like, you should feel really good about that. Even if it takes you 5 or 10 minutes, that's still, really good. But that concept of how often for each family member do I notice and care just a little? I don't need to go talk for 10 minutes and go on and on. It might even embarrass them if I talk too much, but just showing that I see you, I care that you're hurt, even if it's just to say, hey, I'm sorry you had a rough day, and maybe give them a, quick hug.
Or what about just saying, I'm here if you need to talk?
Absolutely. That's another, good one. I'm here if you need to talk. The next level down, though, and this is, we teach on a lot of this in the app, is this concept of helping them process their emotions. So it turns out when we think of our identity, of sort of like, how do humans really think of themselves? Do we think of ourselves as our hair? Do we think of ourselves as our physical body? It turns out the human brain most identifies with our emotions. So if I'm having a certain set of emotions and you minimize those emotions, that to my brain is incredibly hurtful. We identify with the emotions that we feel. So if you minimize those, if you say that they're wrong, if you criticize those, my primitive portions of my brain are going to light up. And what I'm really going to feel is like you are rejecting me. When you reject my emotions, you reject me. Now, the flip side of that is if you validate my emotions and if you can name my emotions, then you really get me. You really, you're validating this most insecure, deep down part of me that, we all, want to feel loved and feel good enough. You're validating that. So this ability, the skill set to be able to, when somebody's upset, to be able to name the underlying emotions that they're having is the number one way to build deep bonds. So it's basically, let's say, a child has a toy that's broken. So we can, and they're crying about that. So I'll first kind of give some examples of the way that you don't want to do it. So one way to do it would, to not do it would be to say, you've got lots of toys. Well, what are you, this is nothing to get upset about. You're overreacting to this situation. All of that might be correct, right? From just a literal situation, that all might be accurate. But what you're basically doing is hurting the deep bond with that child. And you're saying your feelings aren't correct. And what the human brain takes that as saying is, you're not correct. You are not a good enough human, which I know sounds silly, right? It seems like, well, I'm not trying to say that. When I say they're overreacting, when I say that's not what I'm saying, is that they're a flawed person, but that's what their brain hears, is that they are a flawed person.
Right.
So what we want to do instead is name what they're feeling, like, oh, are you disappointed that now you don't get to play with the toy? Yes. Are you worried that you'll, never get to play with a toy like that again? Yes. Were you concerned that I was going to get onto you? Yes. The more of these underlying emotions that you can name, the more, strangely, what you're saying is you are good enough. And that is this core issue of long-term well-being is this, we're constantly gauging, are we good enough in society? And so where you can get to is that the child will say, you get me. And it was weird. The first time, one of my kids said that, it sort of shocked me because I kind of knew that was the ultimate goal and that if you do this enough, you can get to that level. But it was still shocking when they would say, Dad, you're one of the only people who really gets me. But that's the goal. That's what we want, because if we feel like somebody really gets us, that gives us just this huge boost in terms of our long-term well-being and so on.
Right. And as you're talking about this, I remember a lady several years ago. I was in a relationship and this person could make me feel bad for the way I felt. Yeah. So for instance, if I was upset that they were out of town and didn't call, just for example, then when I did talk to them, they're like, oh my gosh, you're being ridiculous. You're my first point of contact should anything happen to me. That's irrelevant. But honest to goodness, I would hang up the phone and be like, how did they do that? They made me feel bad for caring.
Yeah.
So I was talking to this lady at work at the time, and she said, your emotions are yours and they are real, and do not let anybody discount those.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think as a society, we need to realize that emotions are never wrong. Actions can be wrong, right? So a child could have, all sorts of emotions, and all of them are correct. They're just a fact that they had those emotions, right? And again, if we say that they're wrong, we're saying the child is fundamentally flawed. That's what the brain, we know from brain scans that that's essentially how the brain takes that. But the action can be wrong. If the sibling then, or if that child reaches out and then, hits their sibling, that's wrong. So actions absolutely can be right or wrong, or what we say, right? If the child says something really hurtful to their sibling, that can be wrong. But feelings are not wrong, right? They're just things that happen. We just have them. They're chemicals that get released in our body, and they might be jealousy, or they might be, being worried, or they might be, different forms of anger, embarrassment, and so on. Those are not wrong. And when we say that they're wrong, we're damaging our relationships with that person and lowering their long-term well-being.
I like that you say that emotions are never wrong, but actions are. Because someone could say, oh, well, they said my emotions are never wrong and I'm mad, so I have a right to go throw these plates around the kitchen. No, that's not what we're saying. You have to recognize the emotion. It's real. It's there. You don't just dismiss it, but you put the proper emotional weight on it. If the dishes aren't done, you can be mad. Allow yourself time to be mad about it. Give yourself 5 minutes. And 5 minutes is a long time, especially when you're timing yourself of, oh, I will give myself 5 minutes to be mad. You'll quickly reduce that to 30 seconds. But yes, you can be mad. Feel that emotion, claim it, name it, but you don't have to react off of it.
That's right. And I like how you talk about sort of the claim it, name it one, which I've sort of also heard somebody call it a name it to tame it is sort of a similar phrase, but that's pretty well, proven where if you have an emotion, we have different parts of our brain, right? You can think of it sort of the thinking part of our brain is sort of what they call the prefrontal cortex is a big part of that. And then you have these more primitive fight or flight portions of our brain. And whenever you try to name the emotions that you're feeling, because we're usually feeling 3 to 5 emotions at any one point in time. And if you can name those, what you're really doing is it's having the logical part of your brain. It calms down the more primitive parts of our brain, those fight or flight parts of our brain. So you're actually, by doing it, you're calming yourself down, and you're able to then sort of act more rationally, and you're not as upset. You can talk yourself out of being upset by just naming those emotions. When you do that for yourself, you not only calm yourself down and reduce your own happiness, but you start building up the skill set that allows you to do that with others, where you can start naming their emotions and building deep bonds with them.
Right. I remember being a teenager and being consumed with rage for whatever reason was going on. And if you would have told me this at that time, I'm like, no, I can't control that, because you get so wound up and your mind just keeps feeding it. And the fight or flight, like you said. And I think as a teenager, our reaction, and I may be wrong, is normally the fight, not the flight. I think the flight part of it comes with wisdom of, I'm just not going to entertain this. I'm just going to walk away from it instead of engaging in negative interaction.
Yeah, I agree. Between those two, flight probably is better. There's a third one, you're probably aware of, freeze, which turns out to be one of the more damaging ones, where you just freeze and don't do anything at all, because it appears that you're sort of like keeping in, all of this emotion. You're not able, and all of this energy that fighting or fleeing if you were physically running away, you sort of release all this, and they can see this in animals also. I agree. I do think some people, it obviously depends on the person. So if somebody tried the fight approach, and then they got even more hurt, right? Let's say, a child tried the fight approach and the adult, then really took it out on them, right? Then they might be afraid to ever do that. And so now they don't fight. They always, do the flight side or the freeze side. So, you have different people kind of react in different ways, but something like rage or anger is a surface emotion. We have these emotion lists that you can name emotions. And so mad, for example, is not on the list because it's a surface emotion. Mad is not what's really going on. It's usually these 3 to 5 underlying emotions of, I'm mad because I'm embarrassed that this, because of this, and I'm nervous about this, and I'm worried about that. And you have all these underlying emotions. So you want to try to name those, right? When you're angry, to say, okay, what's really going on here? What are these underlying emotions? Because if I can figure those out, then I can not only diffuse this situation, but I can diffuse future situations and increase my well-being.
Right. So your app, you've got me really interested in this. Your app walks people through how to learn these skills. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So I'm going to sign up for your app. I'm going to do it because I know that I could use improvement with being a parent. Since I have re-engaged with my stepkids, I know that there's things that I could also use to benefit my relationship with them. I do have to say one thing that I am proud of myself about and proud of my son. He's 15. He'll be 16 in a couple of months. Anytime he leaves the house, we hug each other. And I am so thankful for that because a lot of times when I talk to people, I'm like, I'm a crappy mom. I did this wrong. I did that wrong. Let me go back and see where all my cortisol moments were. But I'm so thankful that we have that relationship because it does mean a lot for me to be able to hug him before he leaves.
I think that's so great. I mean, one thing that moms will often say to me is like, I knew it. I knew, hugs were really important. And, because I think, prior to all this, it's sort of like, that I think a lot of people have this, it's kind of a mom thing. They're always trying to hug everybody and that kind of thing. And, but it, it turns out it's one of the most important things. So I think, the fact that you do that and that, he's willing to do that is great for both of you. Another sort of an easy tip that I think is, what I kind of do is the love you, bye thing. So at the end of the conversation, instead of like, hey, I love you too. Okay, bye. That's a little more awkward, but just sort of like, as you're saying bye, instead of just saying bye, just, all right, love you, bye. And so you kind of throw that in, just as an extra couple words there. It's not as good as the hug. The hug is way better,
right?
Daily hugs, but it's a little one of those, just an extra couple words that, gives that other person the oxytocin, this warm sort of loved feeling. But I think that's, fantastic. I think the more we just didn't know how important that was, how important hugs were, but they're so important. So I think that's fantastic.
We were at Thanksgiving and we were talking about everything going on with COVID and all that. And I got kind of emotional about it. And I said, what bothers me the most is basically we're being told not to hug people. And I remember when my mom was sick in the hospital, I was kissing her on her forehead and the nurse told me basically not to do that because she had the flu and pneumonia. When she told me that, there's a part of me that almost collapsed.
Yeah.
You're telling me I can't hug my mom or kiss my mom. And I remember looking at her and I'm like, what? And she said, we don't want you to get sick. I'm like, lady, I will get sick. I will hug and kiss my mama. That is more important to me. And it's scary to think that with all this social distancing, that we're not able to freely hug people like we were before.
I agree. I think, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't understand that side as much and can't talk to that. But COVID is going to have some really negative impacts, because when you look at those two issues, cortisol and oxytocin, and those specific situations, COVID is making both of them worse, right? We're getting, we've been sort of crammed in the house together more often. We're more agitated, right? So that it's going to make us be more nervous that, that one of us is going to emotionally ambush the other. We're not getting, as much face-to-face contact with other people, which even just sitting in the same room as somebody and looking them eye to eye releases, a lot of good oxytocin.
Or seeing somebody smile. We can't even see people smile.
That's right. That's right. So one thing when we look at oxytocin, so if you text with somebody, you don't get any, right? So that's kind of the worst one to do. Mm-hmm. If you talk on the phone with them, you get a lot more. So that's actually a really good one. If you have a video call with them and you can see them eye to eye, you can see their smile, you get more oxytocin. And then if you're, in their presence and able to, talk to them face to face, that's even more. So you can kind of think about sort of the closer we are to them, the more that we get. So in some ways, there's going to be all these negative issues. The positive side, though, if we try to look at it from a glass half full perspective, is that lots of parents are starting to focus on their kids' mental health. And because of that, they're finding apps like ours, and they're solving issues that are not just COVID related, but they're basically learning these fundamentals that'll help their kids for the rest of their lives. So for parents who are, who would have not thought at all about their children's mental health, now are doing it. And those parents, at least, are actually, COVID will end up being a good thing for their families, ironically. So, it's a little bit of both, but yeah, COVID is definitely exacerbating those two important chemicals.
I'm all about finding the silver lining. And I can see where with the COVID, it could create deeper bonds within your family unit.
Sure. I mean, you get a lot of people who talk about, kids who are, young adults, right? 18 to say 26 or something that, are coming home, right? Or did come home, right? Maybe they're actually leaving now, but during COVID, they came home and, spent more time together as a family. So there definitely are pros and cons, of both. I agree with you. I think it's emotionally healthier too to look at the positive side of things and to try to find that silver lining. There's plenty of evidence that doing that also improves mental health.
Well, it does, and it goes to the whole positive thinking. You've heard of Dr. Daniel Amen and his ants?
It sounds familiar, but it's not coming to mind.
Automatic negative thinking, how our brain works to basically tell us negative things.
Sure.
I really love talking about the ants because the amount of negative thoughts that we have per day is crazy. Like 70-something% of your thoughts are negative.
Sure.
But you can change that. A lot of that is by keeping gratitude journals, by thinking and being more intentional with your thoughts and diligent in your thinking. So when I wake up in the morning, I can go, oh my God, it's cold. I don't want to get out of the bed. Okay, 2 negative thoughts right off the bat. Instead, I could go, oh, I had a good night's sleep and I'm ready to get my day started. You may not really feel that way, but if you tell your mind that, you will start feeling better. It's like you can convince yourself you climbed Mount Everest. How crazy is that?
That's right. I mean, so how brain pathways work is you can think of it as a series of roads. Mm-hmm. And that you can kind of make roads. Like imagine you control the roads in your city and you can decide where new roads get made and, you can decide which roads don't get used anymore and so on. Well, the more negative thoughts that we have, we're literally building brain pathways. So we are, if you could look inside your brain, you're literally building these roads. And as you travel along that road, you have negative emotions. So the more negative thoughts that you have, the more you're building, let's call them negativity roads. And the more likely as life happens, your thoughts will sort of drive down the negativity road, which means you're essentially setting yourself up in the future for bad emotions. Whenever you allow yourself to ruminate on, here's everything that's wrong with my life and so on, you're not just making today worse, right? You're not just feeling bad worse. You're laying roads that, sort of the cars in your mind, to butcher this analogy, they're going to go down by default. So if you say, I'm going to purposefully go out to create positive roads so that in general, when life happens, my thoughts will go down these positive roads, then they're going to trigger positive emotions and I'm going to generally be happier. But we don't tend to think about that. We like to ruminate and kind of think, oh boy, I would sure like to tell this person off. And if I could, I'd tell them this, and this. And it kind of feels good at the time. But the reality is it's setting up it's laying down roads that our brain is going to go down at some point, and that's going to cause these negative emotions. It'll also cause you to do things that you didn't want to do. Like sometimes we might think to ourselves, oh, I'd love to really tell them off, maybe even in a way that I know wouldn't be appropriate, but it's just in my head, so I may as well just let them have it in my head. Well, if you ever notice, when you actually talk to that person, sometimes you'll do what you mentally rehearsed. And you go, oh my gosh, later you think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I was just thinking that in my head because I can get away with it in my head. But you got to be careful, because if you mentally rehearse it, that's what your brain by default will want to do in that situation. So I try to, if I have, some situation where I really don't like, how something happened and I really want to tell that person off how I really feel, I'm pretty careful not to mentally rehearse it that way, because then I can do it. Then I can, find myself in that situation and I find my, saying things that I don't want to say.
Exactly. And it's like you were talking about the primitive brain. That primitive brain is our basis. And so a lot of our negative thinking that we have is a bad habit that we have to break. But once you break that habit and you are more aware of your thoughts and you become more positive in your thinking, you'll notice how negative people are around you.
Right. Yeah. And there's also some research, because I think, what you don't want to say is, hey, you're having negative thoughts, just stop that, right? Like that doesn't work. If you tell the brain, just stop it, it just wants to do it even more. So you want to redirect it. And like you said, you can redirect it to positive thoughts, but oftentimes that can be hard. Like, okay, I'm going to, not to say you shouldn't do it. You absolutely should try to do it. But sometimes it's like, it feels overwhelming to somebody. So another trick that you can do is just think about neutral thoughts. So say, okay, I'm going to purposely find some thoughts that are just very factual about the information, about the situation. I'm going to go home. The house is going to be a mess. I'm just going to think about, this is going to be my plan. I'm going to come in, I'm going to do this first and that next and so on, and have, what they call neutral thoughts.
Right.
That's, another one of those tricks to sort of redirect your brain from negative. Another one is this idea of usually the moment that we're in is fine, right? Usually that if I just look at the second that I'm in right now, I'm fine. Now if I think about the future, I can think of some bad situations that might come up. Or if I think about the past, I can think about some bad situations. But usually if I just say, how is it just right now? How is it for the next minute, for the next 5 minutes? Are things okay? They normally are okay. Mm-hmm. Normally, they're perfectly fine. It's like, hey, I'm not hungry right now, and I'm not in danger right now. And I'm normally okay. So that's the other, I think that, there's some science around that of just saying, just focus on the moment right now. How am I doing right now? Don't think they call that future tripping, where you're thinking too much about the future. And that's, really bringing down, or the past. And that's really bringing down in the moment versus just, hey, right now I'm actually okay. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to think about that. I have what I need right now.
Right. I use my phone to play mindless games a lot of times just because I need a 2-minute distraction to break my thought process.
That's it. Yeah, I completely agree. That just whatever you can do to redirect it, that's a great way to do it. Like I said, you just don't want to just try to stop it, right? If I said, don't think about a pink elephant, whatever you do, don't think about a pink elephant, your brain's going to think about a pink elephant. Like it's just going to go that way. But if you redirect it, and I think those are both great examples of how to do that, then you can, get off that treadmill. there's this thing where if I ruminate about how I'm right and this other person's wrong, there's some weird feel-good feeling of I feel superior to them, like I'm right and they're completely wrong. Here's all the ways that they're wrong. But just sort of realizing that's laying that groundwork, laying those roads, that's going to make my life less happy, right? It's not going to affect them. It's not laying roads in their brain. It's not making brain connections in their brain. It's doing it in mine. So yeah, it's much better for my health to redirect in one of those ways like you talked about.
Yeah, because I'm sure through your studies, you've seen evidence about what stress can do. Stress can literally kill you. It really can.
Absolutely. I mean, essentially, the two issues that I talked about, hospitals are full primarily of people who had those two issues, that they had too much cortisol, in where they were worried emotions were going to plummet, and too little oxytocin. Like that really, I think, started taking off with a study called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. Have you heard of that?
No.
So this was now it's a very, very famous study that happened at Kaiser Permanente, and I think the Center for Disease Control was involved in this. And it measured what we now know are probably the biggest things that affect oxytocin and cortisol. But there are things like, so essentially how it would work is you get a score of between 1 to 10. Everybody gets a score. And they basically ask about these highly traumatic things that happened to you. And for each thing that happened, you get a point. So if you had any physical abuse, you might get 1 point. It didn't matter if it happened once or a bunch of times. Or sexual abuse, you'd get a point. So you get or a parent in prison. And there were all of these things that happened. And what they found was that just looking at that, right, these kind of really extreme situations and counting up how many different extreme things did you have, they found that the hospitals were full of people with high ACEs. And so there's all this research on that. And so absolutely shortens lifespan. If you have those two chemicals off, you can shorten lifespan by 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And, you get all the various, variations of that but it's not at all uncommon for the average person to have 3 to 5 years, less because of, some of these issues. That's the scary side of it. I almost hate to bring that up because it's scary, but it absolutely is a massive physical health issue. You're correct about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Matt, it has been great talking to you, and you're right. I could talk to you for 7 more hours because I've got more questions. But I am going to sign up for this app, and I looked at it just briefly. And one of the things that I noticed was you choose the age range that your kid is, and then you answer some questions, and you decide what you want to improve with your relationship regarding your child. And you have the option to share it with your partner, and then you pick a goal, whether it's casual, regular, serious, or tireless, based 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, or 20 minutes a day. So anybody can do this. You've got 5 minutes a day to where you could take this app and apply the information that it teaches you.
That's right. I mean, we did all of that, the work of, making the app where it was really easy for people to use. So I don't know if I mentioned this, but we have probably 15,000 reviews, and out of a 5-star rating, the average review, our average is something like 4.94. So these are extremely highly rated apps. That's how they became the top apps, parenting apps in the world. So yeah, these are not difficult or boring or all that kind of stuff. They're made to fit into very small, 5 minutes a day kind of thing, or 5 minutes every other day, if that's what you can do, just to fit into your schedule in these bite-sized, easy to implement pieces that will make a really significant difference for you and your family.
Well, we forgot to tell the people what the name of the app is.
The name of the app is The Happy Child. And since it's the top parenting app in the world, you can just go in and search for parenting if you want in the Android Play Store, or the Apple Store, iOS Store. So you'll see it on there, but that's what it's called, the Happy Child. And that's it.
That's awesome. I'm really going to do this, and then I'm going to give some feedback to our listeners, and I'm definitely going to share this out in my Facebook group as well for those that don't listen to the podcast, because even if they nacho their stepkid, they may have bio kids that they could utilize this with. or they could share it with a bio parent to help them learn to build deeper bonds. And also, even if the step-parent nachos, once they start re-engaging, it will give them the chance to realize how they can form these deeper bonds with the stepkids.
Right. I agree.
I think it's a great thing. Well, again, Matt, it has been great talking to you, and thank you for being a guest. And I have a feeling that I'm going to want you back so we can talk about some more stuff. And who knows, maybe we can revamp the family court system.
I would love to be back, and thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks again, and you have a great day.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I do find it ironic that I scheduled these Month of Men a couple months ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Matt Larson talks about a lot of the same stuff that our guest next week talks about.
Interesting. Maybe he's setting the stage.
I don't know, but I just think it's ironic that Matt talks about hugs and then our guest next week talks about hugs.
Maybe they're trying to tell you something.
That I need to hug you.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord.
You know, them really close hugs.
David. See, the court is, y'all can tell when I say David.
That's what it is.
That is a mark that my cortisol levels are extremely high. Yep.
Possibly.
Yep. That's what it is.
All right. Well, apparently whatever constitutes oxytocin for me constitutes cortisol for you.
No.
Because I enjoy pushing your buttons. It makes me happy. I'm
calling Matt, and I'm going to ask him about that because he said it's a win-win.
It is.
Okay. I got to talk to Matt.
Yeah, because I'm helping you desensitize and learn patience.
No. No. You're giving me gray hair and acne.
Oh, come on.
You're stressing me out. You're stressing me out. With that being said, we're almost through with our Month of Men, David.
So sad.
One more week.
All right.
I've enjoyed it, though.
Yeah, I think listeners have too. We got a lot of good feedback.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, even though Matt is not a stepdad or in a blended family, he still offers a lot of great advice to help us in our blends, whether it's our blend with our significant other. Even though Matt normally deals with children, it's still human interaction. And
well, I mean, you know, the whole human improvement project, think about it. You know, blended families are made up of what?
Humans.
We think they're made up of humans. We're not sure. Like, I don't know, like if my dad is fully human.
No, your dad's a part alien. And it makes him proud to think so.
But yeah, I mean, it goes back to the whole improving yourself will improve others.
Yes.
And I think we often come out with trying to improve other people and not ourselves, and it just doesn't really work that way.
There you go. You just summed it all up.
All right. We're good then.
Somebody's going to go, what? This is the shortest outro they've ever had in the history of the Nacho Kids Podcast.
Yep. Sometimes things can change, just not for long.
Yeah, so don't expect it next week.
That's right. All right, y'all. Join us next week for another amazing Nacho Kids Podcast. Peace out. Oh, wait a minute. I forgot to say, life is good.
When you nacho.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Nacho Kids Podcast. Find us online at nachokids.com. Until next time, remember, life is good when you nacho.